Hartford, Connecticut is a city that went through a great deal of urban renewal in the mid-20th century. One well-known example is what happened to the old East Side neighborhood, which included Front Street and was home to generations of immigrants. The East Side was demolished to make way for the construction of Constitution Plaza. Around the same time, the interstate highways were built. They cut through many sections of the city and separated downtown Hartford from the Connecticut River. But a half-century before the building of Constitution Plaza and the highway, an earlier redevelopment project had already started the process of altering the old East Side in the name of civic improvement. This project, which was connected to the building of the Bulkeley Bridge in the first decade of the 20th century, dramatically altered the old Hartford riverfront between Morgan Street and State Street. Hartford and East Hartford were once connected by a covered wooden bridge built in 1818. It was destroyed by a fire on May 17, 1895. Its eventual replacement would be a great stone arch bridge, which we know today as the Bulkeley Bridge. Plans for its design were selected in 1903, and construction was completed in 1908. During this period, the city also undertook the creation of a scenic boulevard on either side of the bridge that would form an appropriately grand approach to the capital city. Called Connecticut Boulevard, it has since been replaced by highways on the Hartford side. It still exists on the East Hartford side, although it's now lined with car dealerships. To create this new boulevard on the Hartford side, the bridge commissioners removed most of the last traces of the old riverfront area in what was the city's largest urban renewal project up to that time. This civic improvement was part of the City Beautiful movement that was flourishing at the time. As George E. Wright wrote in his 1908 book Crossing the Connecticut, quote, "This beautiful bridge and boulevard and the vast improvements involved in their construction have completely transformed the riverfront of the city from a condition of filth and squalor to one of cleanliness and neatness, and the whole work stands as a grand memorial to the wisdom and enterprise of the Bridge Commission, loyally supported by the citizenship of Hartford," unquote. This video will look at some of the old traces of Hartford's past that were lost in this first instance of major urban renewal on the East Side. This is a view of Hartford's old East Side from the bird's eye view of the city published in 1877. The view looks towards the west, so the Connecticut River on the east is at the bottom of the image. It shows the old wooden bridge that would burn down in 1895. The bridge led to Morgan Street, which ran westwards up to Main Street. Parallel to that on the south was State Street, which stretched between the riverfront to the area of the old State House. Running north and south was the famous Front Street, now Columbus Boulevard, the heart of the old East Side neighborhood. East of that, closer to the river, was Commerce Street, a dirt road that was quite a bit rougher in real life than this bird's eye view would indicate. Running parallel with Commerce Street is the track of the Connecticut Valley Railroad, which opened in 1871 along the west bank of the Connecticut River. In 1880, it became the Hartford and Connecticut Valley Railroad and would later be leased to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Between the tracks and the river were the old wharves and warehouses, some of which dated back to the days of the old West India trade. From later times, there was a coal yard and the railroad freight yards. All of this would be swept away as part of the new development. This diagram shows what was planned for the transformation of the area. The old Commerce Street would be replaced by a new Connecticut Boulevard. Travelers crossing the bridge into Hartford could now traverse south on this grand thoroughfare, which made a gentle curve to join State Street. Then they proceeded west along State to reach Main Street around the area of the old State House. A rump of the old Commerce Street still existed, extending south of State Street. The railroad tracks were adjusted to accommodate this new boulevard, and a new East Side passenger station was erected adjacent to the new curve. To beautify the area, old buildings were demolished along the river, as well as on the west of the new boulevard. Buildings were also demolished on the north side of Morgan Street to make way for newly constructed replacement railroad freight yards. Returning to the 1877 bird's eye view, let's look more closely at what was lost to all of this development. Zooming in along the river were the railroad's old freight yards. As I mentioned, the replacement yards were built on the north side of Morgan Street. Moving to that area, these are some of the buildings that were razed. Other old buildings at Morgan and Commerce had already been lost when the railroad was built through here in 1871. Now the remaining buildings in this picture were to go. One of them has an advertisement for You Need a Biscuit. The other building displays advertisements for 2 theatrical performances. The Man Who Dared played at the Hartford Opera House in 1902 and 1903. It was a melodrama written by and starring Howard Hall, who, in one dramatic scene, jumps into a den of lions to rescue a lady's glove. On the south side of Morgan Street, between Front Street and Charles Street, was a century-old structure called the Old Yellow Block, or the Pallotti Building. This century-old building was demolished to accommodate the widening of Morgan Street that was part of the approach to the new bridge. The block was built circa 1810 by John Morgan to serve as residences at a time when some of the finest buildings in the city were located in the vicinity. Several decades later, the wealthy had moved away, and the neighborhood had become home to waves of new immigrants. The building then served as a tenement house with shops on the first floor. About 1879, Nicholas Pallotti, recently arrived from Italy, purchased the building, where he lived and kept a meat market. Over the years, he would become a wealthy banker and property owner, and eventually he moved out of the building, but he still owned it and rented it as housing for other Italian immigrants. Sadly, by the first decade of the 20th century, the building was in a dilapidated condition. But when the Bridge Commission attempted to purchase the property, Pallotti demanded $100,000 for it. After years of delay, and with the grand opening of the new bridge imminent, the structure was finally taken by a condemnation proceeding. Pallotti eventually agreed to accept over $50,000 for the building, which he had originally bought for under $10,000. He then commenced to take down the building himself. He and a group of workmen began by clearing out colonies of rats which had taken up residence in some of the outbuildings. A large number of rodents then began pouring from the area. Some of them even tried to run across the bridge to the East Hartford side of the river. Hordes of children gathered around to watch the spectacle. As the Hartford Courant reported on March 18, 1908, quote, "In the building where Pallotti will start his work soon, there were other evidences that the rats were not taking kindly to the change. The Italians, who have been tearing down a few fixtures preparatory to the general shakedown, came downstairs with big stories of the terrible whiskered rats that were continually popping into sight from most everywhere. The building, which until recently was devoted to tenement purposes, is an ideal breeding place for the rats. The garret is full of them, and they are scattered all over the rest of the structure, from roof to cellar. Down there are some old whoppers that come out in the night and put cats on the defensive. Indoors, the Pallotti block bears evidence of the many years of hard usage to which it has been subjected. The almost interminable passageways are poorly lighted, and show lack of cleanliness. Upstairs, the floors are covered with mold and soot, and the smell of a charnel house pervades the whole deserted block. The tenants in the end of the structure on Front Street that is still inhabited have been warned to leave by the 1st of next month. Polati declares he will take the building down himself, but believes it will be a long, wearisome job." Unquote. Along the river, next to the railroad freight yards, were warehouses dating back to 1808, when the West India trade was still flourishing. This had continued to be a bustling area in the vicinity of the Ferry Street slip through the mid-19th century. It was a center of commerce where farmers brought produce and patronized many local businesses alongside sailors and fishermen. There was a ship's chandlery, grocery stores, saloons, and hotels nearby. For years, the area had been a center for fish markets, which were taken down when the railroad came through in 1871. For many years, Asa Farwell, famed for his cherry rum, kept a wholesale and retail liquor business in a warehouse he'd erected in 1840 at the corner of Commerce and Ferry Street. In this view, looking north up Commerce Street, Farwell's old building is on the left. It would be demolished to make way for the new boulevard. Across Commerce Street is a building with an Italianate-style cupola. This was constructed in 1871 at the end of the row of warehouses on the site of a grocery business that had burned down. Called the River House, it served as a hotel for many years. This picture from 1884 shows members of the Hartford Canoe Club in front of the building. Further down the river is the old steamboat dock, which would survive the 1908 improvements. In this postcard from circa 1910, the steamboat dock is on the left, and on the right is the railroad station, built as part of the new development. It replaced the original Valley Branch station built by Edwin Taylor in 1835. Returning to the buildings that were demolished to make way for the new Connecticut Boulevard, the buildings on Commerce Street, south of Farwell's warehouse, were taken down, along with some on the north side of State Street, to allow the bend or curve in the road that would link Connecticut Boulevard with State. Going back to the view looking north up Commerce Street, the building on the far left is labeled T.J. Blake & Son. They were brass founders and coppersmiths. Here's a view looking south with the railroad tracks along the riverside on the left and Commerce Street heading to State Street on the right. T.J. Blake & Son is on the far right of this picture. Just south of it are two houses. These were built in the early 19th century by John Pantry Jones and Watson Bacon, back when some of the finest homes in Hartford were still located near the river. By the time they were to be torn down about a century later, the white brick house had an unsavory reputation in the neighborhood, according to the Hartford Current. This is a view looking west, up State Street, towards the old post office building, which back then blocked the old State House from view. Commerce Street comes in on the right, with T.J. Blake and the two houses on the street's west side. To create the curve that connected Connecticut Boulevard and State Street, the buildings at the corner of Commerce Street had to be taken down. For a time, this corner had been the headquarters of a trucking business and was known as Carman's Corner. This is a view of the same area during one of the many floods that for years so often affected this area close to the river. This picture shows the view looking east down State Street towards Commerce Street. The building on the far left would survive the new development and last until the 1950s. But all of the other buildings here on the north side of State Street would be demolished to create the bend in the road. This is part of a postcard that shows the completed curve and where the buildings that were demolished had stood. Expanding to the full postcard, it shows what the completed Connecticut Boulevard looked like and how thorough all the demolition had been. This is another postcard view of the same area. This is a section of the Hartford Atlas of 1896, before the area was changed, showing the intersection of Commerce and State Streets. You can compare it with the Atlas of 1909. The buildings that I've X'd out on the left were demolished to create the bend on the right. Zooming out, the atlas shows the area after all the clearances had been completed. Things would remain much like this for almost another half-century. That was when every building shown on this map was demolished to make way for the highways and Constitution Plaza. So here's another comparison. This is the east side and the riverfront area after the urban renewal of the first decade of the 20th century that accompanied the building of the Bulkeley Bridge. And here's the same area after the urban renewal of the 1950s and 60s. Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. And also you can leave comments. You can hit the like button. You can also visit my website, historicbuildingsct.com.